The sound of children crying in a graveyard on a rain-soaked afternoon was the last thing Richard Cole expected to hear when he finally found the courage to visit his wife's grave after 3 months of avoiding it. But there they were, 2 small boys huddled together in the mud, their thin shoulders shaking with grief so raw it stopped his heart. If this story touches your heart the way it touched mine, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories matter because they remind us that love never truly dies, and sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest pain. Now let me take you back to that rainy afternoon that changed everything. Richard had been sitting on the cold marble bench for nearly an hour, his expensive suit soaked through, his graying hair plastered to his forehead, but he barely noticed the rain anymore. The droplets mixed with tears he had been holding back since the funeral, since the moment they lowered Evelyn into the earth and took away the only person who had ever truly known him. His hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles white, breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged in the October chill. The tombstone before him read, Evelyn Marie Cole, beloved wife, and the dates that marked a life cut far too short, and he stared at those words until they blurred and lost all meaning, because how could 26 letters possibly capture the woman who had been his entire world, who had smiled at him across crowded rooms and made him believe that a man built from ambition and cold calculation could actually deserve love. He had stayed away from this place because coming here made it real in a way that hiding in his mansion surrounded by her photographs and her clothes still hanging in the closet could not make it real. And he had built an empire on control and strategy and the ability to compartmentalize everything, but grief was something that refused to be filed away or delegated to subordinates or solved with money and power. The rain fell harder, drumming against his shoulders, and he welcomed the cold because at least it was something he could feel, something that cut through the numbness that had wrapped around him like a shroud since that terrible morning when he woke up and found her gone, just gone, as if she had been nothing more than a dream his lonely heart had conjured. That was when he heard it, faint at first beneath the rain, a sound that did not belong in this quiet place of stone and silence, the unmistakable hiccuping sobs of children trying and failing to cry quietly. Richard lifted his head slowly, confusion cutting through the fog of his grief, and turned to see 2 small figures perhaps 30 feet away, kneeling in the wet grass beside a grave, their bodies pressed close together as if trying to become one person. They were boys, twins by the look of them, identical in their dirt-streaked faces and tangled dark hair that hung in wet strings around their ears, and they wore clothes that might have once been decent but were now little more than rags, torn shirts too thin for the weather and pants with holes at the knees, and their feet, God help him, their feet were bare and caked with mud. Richard rose from the bench without thinking, his legs unsteady, his heart suddenly pounding with something that was not quite his own grief but rather a sharp protective instinct he had not felt in years. Not since Evelyn had miscarried their only pregnancy 5 years ago and the doctors had told them there would be no children, no legacy beyond the cold empire he had built. He moved toward the boys slowly, not wanting to startle them, his shoes squelching in the saturated earth, and as he drew closer he could hear their whispered conversation, one boy trying to comfort the other in a voice thin and reedy with exhaustion. The rain seemed to fall even harder as Richard stopped a few feet away, uncertain what to say or do. This man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals reduced to awkward silence by 2 children who looked like they had not eaten a proper meal in days. Finally, he cleared his throat, and both boys spun around with identical expressions of fear and surprise, their eyes wide and dark and haunted in ways that children's eyes should never be haunted, and Richard felt something crack in his chest at the sight of them. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended, not angry but thick with emotion he could not name. The boys did not answer immediately, just clutched each other tighter, and Richard realized how he must look to them, this tall stranger in an expensive suit standing over them in the rain, and he tried again, softer this time, gentler. "It's okay," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The older of the 2 boys, or at least the one who seemed to have appointed himself spokesman, lifted his chin with a dignity that seemed impossibly mature for someone who could not be more than 7 years old. "We came to see our mother," the boy said, his voice barely audible over the rain, and he pointed with one small hand toward the grave they had been kneeling beside, the same grave Richard had been sitting before, Evelyn's grave. Richard felt the world tilt sideways, felt the rain become suddenly louder and the ground less solid beneath his feet. "What did you say?" he whispered, and the boy repeated it with the patience of someone who had learned young that adults did not always listen the first time. "Our mother," he said. "We came to say goodbye because we didn't get to come to the funeral and Noah's been crying every night because he thinks she left us on purpose, but I told him she wouldn't do that. She loved us, she always loved us." The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other, and Richard could only stand there feeling like he had been punched in the stomach, trying to make sense of what he was hearing because it could not be true, it could not possibly be true, Evelyn had never mentioned children, had grieved with him when they lost their baby, had held him while he cried and promised him that they would be enough for each other, just the two of them, and she would never have lied to him, would never have kept something this enormous hidden. "You're confused," Richard heard himself say, his voice hollow and distant. "This is my wife's grave. She didn't have any children. You must be thinking of someone else." But even as he spoke the words, he was looking at the boys more closely, seeing details he had missed in his initial shock, the shape of their faces that was somehow familiar, the curve of their cheekbones and the set of their mouths, and most of all their eyes, dark brown and flecked with gold in a way that made his breath catch because those were Evelyn's eyes. He had spent 12 years memorizing those eyes, and now he was seeing them stare back at him from two small faces streaked with mud and tears. The older boy reached into his pocket with hands that shook from cold or fear or both, and pulled out something small and tarnished, a locket on a broken chain, and held it out to Richard with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence in a trial that would determine his entire future. "She gave us this," the boy said, "before she got too sick. She said to keep it safe and that one day we might need to show it to our father if we could ever find him." Richard took the locket with fingers that had gone numb, and it took him 3 tries to work the tiny clasp because his hands were shaking so badly, and when it finally opened he saw a photograph inside, faded and water-stained but unmistakable, Evelyn's face smiling up at him from the small metal frame, younger than he remembered her, her hair longer and her smile carrying something he had never seen in all their years together, a kind of sad knowledge that made him want to weep. The locket slipped from his fingers and he caught it at the last second, clutching it to his chest as if it might disappear if he let go, and he looked from the photograph to the boys and back again, seeing the truth written in every line of their faces, in the shape of their noses and the way they held themselves and the sadness in their eyes that was too old and too deep for children their age. "How is this possible?" Richard said, and it was not really a question, more a prayer to a God he had stopped believing in the day Evelyn died. The rain plastered his hair to his skull and ran into his eyes and down his neck, but he did not move, just stood there swaying slightly as his entire understanding of the last 12 years rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. The boys watched him with expressions that managed to be both hopeful and terrified, waiting for him to reject them or accept them, to be the father they had never known or just another adult who would walk away. Richard's vision blurred and he realized he was crying again, not the silent tears he had shed before but great racking sobs that shook his entire body, and he sank to his knees in the mud not caring about his suit or his dignity or anything except the 2 small boys who were staring at him with concern that no child should have to feel for a grown man. "I'm sorry," he choked out, though he was not sure what he was apologizing for, whether it was for doubting them or for never being there or for the years they had spent without him while he lived in luxury and convinced himself he was alone in the world. "I'm so sorry." The younger boy, Noah, took a tentative step forward and then another, and before Richard could process what was happening the child had wrapped thin arms around his neck and was holding on with desperate strength. And then the other boy was there too, Eli, both of them clinging to him like drowning swimmers clinging to driftwood, and Richard gathered them against his chest and held them as the rain poured down and washed away 3 months of carefully maintained composure. They were so small, so impossibly fragile, all sharp bones and cold skin, and they smelled like rain and earth and unwashed hair, and Richard thought his heart would shatter completely from the weight of all the days he had missed, all the nights they had spent afraid and alone while he grieved for a woman who had carried these impossible secrets to her grave. He did not know how long they knelt there in the mud, the 3 of them locked together, but eventually the rain began to ease and Richard became aware that the boys were shivering violently against him, their teeth chattering, and he forced himself to pull back and look at them properly. "You're freezing," he said, his voice still thick with tears. "Come on, let's get you out of this weather. My car is just over there. We need to get you warm and dry." The boys exchanged a glance, some silent twin communication passing between them, and then Eli nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "but what about our stuff? We left our bag under the bridge where we've been sleeping." Richard felt something hot and sharp twist in his chest at those words, "under the bridge where we've been sleeping," and he had to swallow hard before he could speak. "We'll get your bag," he promised. "But first we need to take care of you. Is that all right?" They nodded in unison, and Richard stood carefully, his knees protesting, and shrugged out of his suit jacket despite being soaked to the bone himself because the boys needed it more than he did. He draped it around both their shoulders and it swallowed them completely, the sleeves hanging past their hands, and they huddled inside it together as he led them across the cemetery toward the parking lot where his black Mercedes waited. He opened the back door and the boys scrambled inside, pressing close together on the leather seat, and Richard cranked the heat up as high as it would go before pulling out of the lot with hands that still trembled on the steering wheel. The drive back to the mansion passed in a blur of silence broken only by the boys' occasional whispers to each other, Words Richard could not quite make out, but that sounded like maybe he's really our dad, and do you think he'll let us stay? And I'm scared, Eli, what if he changes his mind? Each whispered word felt like a knife between his ribs, because they should not have to be afraid, should not have to wonder if they would be wanted, these children who were his flesh and blood, even if he had never known they existed until an hour ago. The gates of his estate swung open automatically, and Richard pulled up the long circular driveway, watching in his rearview mirror as the boys pressed their faces to the window and stared at the mansion with wide eyes. Is this where you live? Noah asked, his voice full of wonder, and Richard nodded mutely because he could not trust himself to speak without breaking down again. The house that had felt like a mausoleum for the past 3 months suddenly looked obscene in its grandeur, 3 stories of white stone and gleaming windows and manicured lawns, all of it empty and cold and meaningless compared to the 2 shivering children in his back seat. He parked and came around to help them out, and they stood on the gravel driveway looking lost and overwhelmed, his jacket still wrapped around them like a shared blanket. The front door opened before they reached it, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared on the threshold with her usual expression of professional calm, but her eyes widened when she saw the boys. Mr. Cole, she said, her accented English careful and controlled. Is everything all right? Richard realized how this must look, him soaking wet and wild-eyed with 2 bedraggled children, and he knew he needed to say something, but his mind felt sluggish and overwhelmed. Mrs. Chen, he managed finally. These are my sons. My sons, Eli and Noah. They're going to be staying with us. Could you please prepare 2 of the guest rooms and have Marcus bring up some warm clothes, anything we have that might fit them, and food, we need food, something warm and easy on their stomachs. Mrs. Chen's professional mask slipped for just a moment, shock and confusion flickering across her features before she recovered and nodded briskly. Of course, Mr. Cole. Right away. She disappeared into the house, and Richard ushered the boys inside, watching as they stepped onto the marble floor of the entrance hall and looked up and up at the vaulted ceiling and the crystal chandelier that hung like a frozen waterfall above their heads. They moved as if afraid to touch anything, their bare feet leaving muddy prints on the pristine floor, and Richard felt a wave of anger at himself for all of this, the opulence that had seemed so important once and now felt like an obscene display of everything he had valued more than the people who should have mattered most. Come on, he said gently, leading them down the hall toward the living room. Let's get you cleaned up and warm. The boys followed silently, their eyes darting around as if trying to memorize every detail, and Richard steered them toward the massive sectional sofa positioned in front of a fireplace that could have roasted an entire pig. He grabbed a cashmere throw blanket from one of the chairs and wrapped it around them, then knelt in front of the fireplace to start a fire with hands that had forgotten how to perform such simple domestic tasks because he always had staff to do these things, but right now he needed to be the one doing it, needed to be the one taking care of them. The kindling caught and flames began to lick up the logs, and Richard sat back on his heels and watched as the boys scooted closer to the heat, their faces turned toward the fire like flowers seeking sun. You're safe now, he said quietly, not sure if he was trying to convince them or himself. You're home. Whatever happened before, wherever you've been, that's over now. You're my sons and this is your home, and I'm not going to let anything hurt you again. Noah turned to look at him with those heartbreaking eyes that were so much like Evelyn's. Promise, he whispered, and Richard felt his throat close up at the desperate hope in that single word. I promise, he said hoarsely. On your mother's grave, I promise. The boys seemed to relax slightly at that, some of the tension leaving their small shoulders, and they burrowed deeper into the blanket and watched the fire with the glazed expression of people who have been running on fumes for too long and can finally afford to stop. Mrs. Chen returned with Marcus, the groundskeeper, who carried an armload of towels and what looked like some of the clothes Richard had bought for charity donations the previous Christmas, still in their packaging. The boys were too tired or too overwhelmed to protest as Mrs. Chen gently herded them toward one of the downstairs bathrooms, promising them hot chocolate and sandwiches after they cleaned up, and Richard was left alone in the living room listening to the crackle of the fire and trying to process what had just happened to his carefully ordered life. He pulled the locket from his pocket where he had shoved it and opened it again, studying Evelyn's face in the photograph, searching for some explanation in her captured smile. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered to the image. Why did you keep them secret? Did you think I wouldn't want them? Did you think I would turn you away? The questions had no answers, only the hollow echo of his own voice in the too large room, and Richard closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the sofa cushion and tried to remember if there had been signs he missed. Clues that Evelyn had been keeping part of herself hidden from him. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew Mrs. Chen was touching his shoulder gently and telling him the boys were clean and fed and asking where he wanted them to sleep. Richard jerked upright, disoriented, and saw that darkness had fallen outside the windows and the fire had burned down to embers. The boys, he said. Where are they? In the kitchen finishing their soup, Mrs. Chin replied. Mr. Cole, if I may say so, they are very thin. When did they last have a proper meal? Richard shook his head helplessly. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know anything about them. I didn't even know they existed until today. Mrs. Chen's expression softened in a way he had never seen in all the years she had worked for him. They are good boys, she said quietly. Frightened but brave. They asked if they could stay together in one room rather than being separated. Richard nodded immediately. Of course, he said. Put them in the blue guest room, the one with the twin beds. Make sure they have everything they need. Mrs. Chin nodded and disappeared, and Richard hauled himself to his feet and made his way to the kitchen where he found Eli and Noah sitting at the breakfast bar in oversized sweatpants and t-shirts that had been rolled up at the ankles and sleeves, spooning soup into their mouths with the focused intensity of the truly hungry. They looked up when he entered and Eli offered a tentative smile. This is the best soup I've ever had, he said, and Richard felt his heart clench because it was just canned tomato soup, nothing special, but to these boys who had been living under a bridge it was a feast. I'm glad you like it, Richard managed. Mrs. Chin is going to get your room ready. You'll have real beds tonight, and tomorrow we'll get you some clothes that actually fit and anything else you need. The boys exchanged another one of those silent looks, and then Noah said in a small voice, Are you sure we can stay? You won't change your mind? The question hit Richard like a physical blow because what kind of life had these children lived that they expected to be abandoned, that they could not trust even the most basic promises? I'm not going to change my mind, he said firmly, moving closer to them and crouching down so he was at their eye level. I know this is all very strange and sudden, and I know you don't really know me yet, but I am your father and I want you here. This is your home now. For as long as you want it to be. Noah's eyes filled with tears and he set down his spoon with a clatter. Our mom used to tell us about you, he said. She said you were busy with important work, but that you were a good man and that she loved you very much and that someday maybe we'd get to meet you. We didn't know how to find you though. And then she got sick and it happened so fast and the people who were supposed to take care of us after didn't want to keep us together, so we ran away and we've been looking for Mom's grave because she told us once where it was and we thought if we came here maybe somehow you'd find us because she always said you'd take care of us if you knew about us, but we didn't know if that was true or just something Mom say to make you feel better. The words tumbled out in a breathless rush and by the end Noah was crying openly, and Eli had set down his own spoon and put an arm around his brother's shoulders, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. Richard felt something fundamental shift inside him, some wall he had built around his heart after Evelyn died crumbling into dust, and he reached out and pulled both boys into his arms, holding them as they cried, their small bodies shaking with relief and grief and exhaustion. I've got you, he murmured into their hair. I've got you now and I'm not letting go. They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them tangled together in the middle of the gleaming kitchen, and when the boys finally pulled back their faces were blotchy and wet but somehow lighter, as if crying had released some of the weight they had been carrying. Mrs. Chin appeared in the doorway and announced that their room was ready, and Richard walked them upstairs, each boy holding one of his hands, their small fingers curled trustingly around his larger ones. The blue guest room had been transformed, the twin beds made up with fresh sheets and fluffy comforters, a lamp casting warm light over everything, and someone had found a basket of toys from God knows where and set it in the corner. The boys released Richard's hands and moved into the room slowly, touching things with reverent care, and when Noah climbed onto one of the beds and sank into the mattress he let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. It's so soft, he said wonderingly, and Eli climbed onto the other bed and bounced experimentally, a smile breaking across his face. Richard watched them from the doorway, his chest tight with too many emotions to name. Get some rest, he said softly. I'll be right down the hall if you need anything. Just call for me and I'll come. He started to back out of the room but Eli's voice stopped him. Dad, the boy said hesitantly, testing the word, and Richard's vision blurred. Yes, he managed. Thank you, Eli said simply. Thank you for not sending us away. Richard could not speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded and pulled the door mostly closed, leaving it open a crack so light from the hallway would spill in, and then he walked on unsteady legs to his study and collapsed into the leather chair behind his desk and put his face in his hands and wept like a child. He cried for Evelyn, for the secrets she had carried and the burden she had borne alone, and he cried for the boys who had spent 7 years of their lives without a father, and most of all he cried for himself, for the man he had been who had been so consumed with building his empire that he had not noticed his wife slipping away from him, had not seen the signs that she was hiding something enormous, had valued board meetings and merger negotiations over the quiet moments that might have led to honesty and trust. The sobs came in waves, each one tearing through him, and when they finally subsided he felt hollowed out and exhausted but somehow cleaner, as if the tears had washed away some of the poison that had been festering in his soul. He must have fallen asleep in the chair because the next thing he knew there was a soft knock on the study door and he opened his eyes to see Noah standing in the doorway, still wearing the oversized clothes, his hair sticking up in tufts, clutching something against his chest. Richard sat up quickly, his neck protesting. "Noah," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "What's wrong? Is everything okay?" Noah moved into the room with the careful steps of someone walking through a dream. "Eli's asleep," he whispered, as if afraid to wake his brother 3 rooms away. "But I can't sleep yet because Mom told us that if we ever found you we had to give you something and I promised I would do it, so I need to give it to you now before I forget or lose it." He held out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn at the creases as if it had been opened and closed many times, and Richard took it with trembling fingers. It was a letter written in Evelyn's distinctive handwriting, the loops and curves as familiar to him as his own face in the mirror. He stared at his name written across the top, "Richard, my love," and for a moment he could not make himself read further because once he did there would be no going back, no more room for doubt or confusion, only truth. Noah watched him with solemn eyes, waiting, and Richard unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dearest Richard," the letter began, and even through the faded ink he could hear Evelyn's voice speaking the words. "If you are reading this, then my boys have found you and I am likely gone, and I can only pray that you will forgive me for what I kept from you. I know these words are inadequate, that there is no explanation that can make right what I have done, but I need you to understand that everything I did was out of love and fear and the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, things would work out." Richard's hands shook so badly he had to set the letter on the desk to continue reading, his eyes racing over the words as if they might disappear if he did not consume them quickly enough. "When we lost our baby 5 years ago," Evelyn had written, "something broke in both of us. You threw yourself into your work and I understand why, I do, but Richard, you were gone all the time and I was so lonely in that big house, so lost, and I made a mistake. I sought comfort in the wrong place from someone I barely knew, and by the time I realized what I had done I was pregnant with twins and the man was gone and I was terrified." The words blurred and Richard had to stop and breathe, had to force himself to continue because he needed to know everything, needed to understand. "I should have told you immediately," the letter went on, "but I was afraid you would leave me, would think I had betrayed you deliberately, and I could not bear the thought of losing you after losing our child. So I hid the pregnancy, told you I was going to visit my sister for several months, and I gave birth to Eli and Noah in secret and placed them with a woman I trusted to care for them until I could figure out how to tell you the truth. But months turned into years and I kept finding reasons to delay, kept telling myself that the time was not right, that you were too stressed or too busy or that I was too afraid, and the boys grew up without their father and without their mother except for the secret visits I made when I could slip away without you noticing." Richard felt bile rise in his throat and he had to stop reading to press his fists against his eyes and try to breathe through the pain. Noah stood quietly near the desk, patient and still, as if he had become used to waiting for adults to process difficult truths. After a moment Richard forced himself to continue, to read the rest of what Evelyn had written. "By the time I realized I was sick," the letter continued, "it was too late to explain everything without causing more pain than my secret had already caused. The doctors gave me months, not years, and I spent that time trying to prepare the boys as best I could, telling them about you, showing them pictures, making them promise that they would find you after I was gone. I know I should have told you before I died, should have given you the chance to meet them while I was still alive to facilitate it, but I was weak and selfish and afraid you would hate me, and I did not want to spend my final days watching you try to hide your anger and disappointment. I know this is an enormous burden to place on you, Richard. I know you never asked for this and that you have every right to turn them away, to reject children who are not biologically yours and who represent my greatest betrayal. But they are innocent in all of this, and they are such good boys, so kind and brave and full of the love I tried to give them even from a distance. They need a father, someone to protect them and guide them, and you are the only man I have ever trusted to do that. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me, if you can look past my mistakes and see these children for who they are rather than what they represent, I believe you will find that they can fill some of the emptiness we both felt after we lost our baby. I love you, Richard. I have always loved you, even when I was lying to you, even when I was making choices I knew would hurt you. I hope that wherever I am now I can see you reading this, can see you meeting our boys, can watch as you become the father they have always deserved. Please don't let my mistakes poison your chance at happiness. Please give them the life I always wanted to provide but never could. They are my greatest gift to you, my final act of love, and I pray you will accept them. Forever yours, even beyond death, Evelyn." Richard set the letter down carefully and discovered his face was wet with tears again, and when he looked up Noah was crying too, silent tears tracking down his cheeks. "She was scared you'd be angry," Noah whispered. "She cried a lot near the end, said she'd made so many mistakes. Are you angry? Are you going to send us away? The question broke something in Richard that had not yet broken, some final piece of his old self that had valued pride and image over vulnerability and truth. He pushed back from the desk and dropped to his knees in front of Noah and gathered the boy into his arms. No, he said fiercely, his voice cracking. No, I'm not angry and I'm not sending you away. Your mother made mistakes, but so did I, Noah. I was so focused on work and success that I didn't notice she was hurting, didn't create a space where she felt safe telling me the truth. We both failed each other in different ways. But you and your brother, you didn't fail anyone. You're innocent in all of this and I want you here. Do you understand? I want you and Eli here with me. Noah clung to him with desperate strength. Even though we're not really yours, he said into Richard's shoulder. Even though our real father was someone else? Richard pulled back and looked the boy in the eyes, those eyes that were so heartbreakingly like Evelyn's. Biology doesn't make a father, he said firmly. Being there makes a father. Loving you and protecting you and showing up every day, that's what makes me your father if you'll let me be. Your mother was right about one thing, you and Eli are a gift. The greatest gift anyone has ever given me. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. Noah searched his face as if looking for lies or cracks in the promise, and whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly and pressed his face back against Richard's chest. Okay, he whispered. Okay, Dad. Richard held him until the boy's breathing evened out and his body went heavy with sleep, and then he carefully lifted Noah and carried him back to the blue guest room where Eli was still curled under his comforter, thumb in his mouth, and Richard laid Noah in the other bed and tucked the covers around him and stood watching them sleep for a long time. They looked so small in the big beds, so vulnerable, and Richard thought about all the nights they had spent cold and hungry and afraid while he lived in luxury and mourned a woman who had left him more than he ever realized. He reached out and gently brushed the hair back from each boy's forehead, a gesture that felt awkward and unpracticed but also profoundly right. I'm here now, he whispered to them. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. He left the door open wider this time and made his way to the master bedroom where he had not slept since before Evelyn died, had instead spent his nights on the couch in his study or in one of the guest rooms because he could not bear to sleep in the bed they had shared. But tonight something was different. Tonight he felt like maybe it was time to stop running from the ghost of his wife and instead try to understand her, to forgive her and himself and find a way forward. He lay on top of the covers fully clothed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the letter, about Evelyn's fear and loneliness and the impossible choices she had made. Part of him wanted to be angry, wanted to rage at her for keeping such an enormous secret, but the larger part understood because grief did strange things to people, made them irrational and afraid and capable of decisions they would never make in clearer moments. She had been protecting herself the only way she knew how, and in doing so she had protected him from a truth she thought would destroy their marriage. And in the end perhaps she had been right because if she had told him about the boys back when they were infants he did not know if he would have had the grace to accept them as his own. But now he had no choice but to accept them because they were here and they were hurting and they needed him in a way no one had ever needed him before. His business empire would survive without his constant attention, but these boys would not survive without a father who chose them deliberately and completely. For the first time since Evelyn's death Richard felt something other than grief and emptiness, felt instead a sense of purpose that cut through the fog and gave him a reason to get out of bed tomorrow and the day after and all the days that would follow. Sleep finally took him as dawn was breaking, and when he woke 3 hours later his body ached from sleeping in his clothes but his mind felt clearer than it had in months. He showered and dressed in casual clothes, jeans and a sweater he had not worn in years, and made his way downstairs to find the boys already awake and sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Chin, who was attempting to teach them how to properly fold napkins. They looked up when he entered and Eli grinned. "Good morning, Dad," he said, and the casual use of the title made Richard's chest tight with emotion. "Good morning," he replied, his voice only slightly rough. "Did you sleep well?" Both boys nodded enthusiastically and launched into a detailed description of how soft the beds were and how warm the room stayed and how they had never been in such a nice house before, and Richard listened and smiled and felt something warm unfurl in his chest. When they paused for breath he said, "What would you like for breakfast?" Mrs. Chin started to rise but Richard waved her back down. "I've got this," he said, surprising himself. "What do you boys like? Pancakes?" The twins looked at each other in that silent communication they had and then Eli said carefully, "We've never had pancakes." Richard felt his throat tighten but kept his expression neutral. "Well," he said, "that's something we need to fix immediately. Pancakes it is." He moved around the kitchen with the rusty competence of someone who had once cooked for himself before he became wealthy enough to hire staff, pulling out ingredients and mixing bowls, and the boys watched him with fascination as he whisked eggs and flour into batter and heated the griddle. The first pancakes were disasters, burnt on the outside and raw in the middle, and Richard was about to apologize when the boys burst into giggles, real child laughter that sounded like sunlight after rain. "It's okay," Noah said between giggles. "We don't mind burnt stuff. We've eaten way worse." Richard found himself laughing too, the sound strange and foreign in his own ears, and he tried again and this time produced pancakes that were at least edible if not pretty. He stacked them on plates and added butter and syrup and set them in front of the boys, who dug in with enthusiasm that suggested they were not exaggerating about having eaten worse. As they ate, Richard sat across from them and nursed a cup of coffee and watched them, memorizing the way they chewed and swallowed and occasionally kicked their feet under the table, the small unconscious movements of children who were finally relaxed enough to forget to be afraid. So he said carefully, "I know everything is very new and strange right now, but I want you to know that this is your home now. We're going to get you enrolled in school and get you proper clothes and anything else you need. And I want to teach you about your mother, about who she really was, because I think she would want that." Eli looked up from his pancakes, syrup on his chin. "Did you love her a lot?" he asked. Richard felt the familiar ache in his chest, but it was softer now, less jagged. "Yes," he said simply. "I loved her more than I knew how to say. She was the best person I ever knew. Even with her mistakes, she was better than I deserved." The boys nodded seriously as if they understood, and maybe they did. Maybe grief was something that transcended age and experience. After breakfast, Richard suggested they go for a walk on the grounds, and the boys agreed eagerly, pulling on the 2 large sneakers Marcus had found in the donation pile. They explored the gardens and the pond and the greenhouse, and everywhere they went the boys asked questions about Evelyn, what she liked and what she laughed at and whether she had been happy here. Richard answered as honestly as he could, painting a picture of a woman who loved gardening and old movies and Sunday mornings, who had a terrible singing voice but sang anyway, who had been both stronger and more fragile than anyone realized. As they walked, Noah suddenly tugged on Richard's sleeve. "Can we go see Mom's grave again?" he asked. "I want to tell her we found you. That we're okay now." Richard felt his eyes burn and he nodded, not trusting his voice, and they walked back to the house and climbed into the Mercedes and drove back to the cemetery through morning sunshine that felt like a blessing after yesterday's rain. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful in the early light, dew still clinging to the grass, and the boys ran ahead to Evelyn's grave while Richard followed more slowly, his heart pounding with an emotion he could not name. The boys had stopped at a flower vendor near the entrance and bought wildflowers with the few crumpled bills they had in their pockets, and now they were arranging these flowers carefully on the grave, their small hands reverent and gentle. Richard stood behind them and stared at his wife's name carved in stone and tried to find words that would encompass everything he felt. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, sorry I made you feel like you couldn't tell me the truth, sorry I let work matter more than you did. I can't change the past, Evelyn, but I can promise you that I'll take care of them. Our boys. I'll give them everything you wanted for them and more. I'll love them the way you loved them, fiercely and completely, and I'll make sure they always know how much you sacrificed for them." The boys had turned to watch him, their eyes bright with tears, and Richard knelt down and opened his arms and they came to him without hesitation, the 3 of them forming a tight circle there in front of Evelyn's grave. "Can she hear us?" Noah asked. "Do you think she knows we're here?" Richard thought about faith and heaven and all the things he was not sure he believed, and then he looked at the boys and said, "Yes. I think she knows. I think she's been watching over you this whole time, leading you here to me. And I think she's at peace now knowing you're safe." They stayed for a while longer, talking to Evelyn in soft voices, telling her about the house and the pancakes and how they were going to be a family now, a real family, and Richard felt something inside him finally begin to heal, the jagged edges of his grief softening into something he could live with. When they finally stood to leave, the boys each took one of his hands again, and they walked back to the car together, 3 people who had been broken separately now beginning to knit themselves into something whole. The days that followed were full of adjustments and small discoveries. Richard learned that Eli liked to draw and Noah loved to read, that they both had nightmares sometimes but felt better when they could sleep in the same room, that they were fiercely protective of each other and slow to trust but capable of enormous affection once they felt safe. He learned to braid hair and tie shoes and referee arguments over whose turn it was to pick the movie, learned that being a father had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with showing up day after day even when it was hard and you did not know what you were doing. He hired a tutor to work with them until they were ready for school, bought them clothes that actually fit and toys they had never dreamed of owning, but more importantly he gave them his time, sitting with them in the evenings and reading aloud or playing games or just listening as they slowly opened up about their lives before they found him. Some of their stories made him want to weep, tales of hunger and cold and adults who had hurt them or failed to protect them, but he listened without judgment and held them when they cried and promised them over and over that those days were behind them now.